Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I am the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader, and we'll be conducting the webinar tonight. Just watching a couple of people join. It's always kind of happens right at the last minute. So let's jump right in. Like last night's webinar, this is a very full webinar. So I see some names of people that I recognize, and I see some new ones. So for those that are new and don't know this process, you can ask questions as we go, and I do encourage you to do so. And you could do so in the little box on the top right-hand corner. For those of you that know how to work the system, can you confirm you can hear me by putting a question? Just type a question in there. Yes, I can hear you. Great. Thanks, everybody. All right, you got it. Awesome. Okay, and I assume you can see the screen. Wow, that's a lot of response. All right, let me delete all those. Be careful what you wish for, Tim. Looks like everybody knows how to use the little question box. If you're new here, you have come in on mute and you're not able to communicate, the way you can ask questions is to open and close this little box by this little orange arrow. And down here in the questions line, sometimes you have to open it by clicking on a plus sign here. You can type a question as you go. I will try to answer them as I go because I don't like to have to circle back to like a question because you might have remembered why you asked it or it might have been really important at that time period. That being said, I tend to blend the questions right into the presentation. Before we get started, I want to make sure that we also have one clear understanding. Obviously, you know, one of the things that you probably have heard us preach, and this is just something that Kevin and I really wanted to do when we started out to create WKO4 and the teams that we worked with, was we didn't want to tell people how to coach. We didn't want to say, wow, here's some really new cool science and you can only use this new cool science. Obviously, we put some new ideas, we have a power duration model, we have some new metrics, but we also give you a tool to check, test, produce new, do any type of analytic that you want to do that you can find what works for you. And kind of my mantra is we want WKO4 to be a tool that really helps you learn. So I'm going to give some opinions tonight. They're based on my gathered wisdom and experience. That doesn't make me right. And I really encourage everybody to look deeply at what we're doing, question how it affects you, use it, customize it, build your own. That's the whole greatness of WKO4 and the online community in Facebook. That really is a great place to learn and ask questions. For me, just background, having so many names, just to let you know, I do, even though a lot of people see me as the software leader, my background is in the coaching side. I've been a long-term coach. I do work with select professional athletes right now. I do currently coach Amber Neben, who was the world ITT champion, the current reigning one. I also work with 2 mountain bike pros and another road pro. So I do coach all the time. I used to coach more, but now because I spend a lot of time in front of a computer with software, I coach less, but I do really like keeping my coaching group small and select. It really makes for a great environment for me. So I try to bring some of that wisdom here. Most of you know I share pretty openly my opinions. I believe that, you know, sharing and education is a way that we move the entire coaching business, sport forward. All right, enough background. Let's jump right in because we got a lot of stuff to cover. We're here today to talk about interval training. And interval training, it's funny, it's something that a lot of people ask questions about, like, what is it, right? We all kind of know what it is, but we don't. So interval training really is just some physical training that involves a series of low and high intensity exercise. And a long story short, there's some system of going really hard and then going really easy, right? We go hard, we rest, recover, we repeat. So intervals really is a type of training that we do that is really hard, repeat. I got a couple questions already. One I'm going to stop and answer. Are there any handouts? I put a handout link in the reminder email. Don't skip this webinar to go find that and download what I have, but everything's already there, including the charts and a new build you will need to run the charts I'm going to show you today. So stick with me, watch what we're doing, we can load those later. So interval training really is some go hard, go easy. But you have to ask yourself, on what basis do you prescribe intervals, right? It's so much of your job as a coach. You're either prescribing intervals or you're prescribing ride your bike. It really is a reality, right? And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with riding your bike. That's kind of cool, and it's part of aerobic training, and it plays a role in all our training. But when you really come down to what differentiates you as a coach, which makes you good at what you do, it's your ability to prescribe, work with, understand intervals, and use the tool intervals as a way of getting desired results. So what is the basis you prescribe intervals? Well, really there's two. You really look at two principles of training, principles of exercise that really drive your interval prescription. And then if you're going to start talking about optimizing intervals, you have to start with these two, right? You have to think about the overload principle and the specificity principle. The reality is those two drive your intervals. So let's look at them. Start with specificity. Specificity must develop the specific physiological capabilities required to perform in the given event. So the reality is you have to target these intervals at the individual athletes, the specific physiological capability. That means that the individual athlete's ability to perform something specific in the event. When we look at that, specific, what is specific? You really have four areas that this specific targeting can happen: metabolic, movement pattern, muscle fiber group, and mode of exercise. Now the reality, they're all related, right? These things happen. It's not like you can totally separate one from another, but in cycling and in triathlon, we tend to focus on metabolic. Now don't get me wrong, movement patterns, cadence, right? If you're trying, you're running work, gait work, that type of stuff, stride work, that all can have a role. But when you really talk about it at the core, the driving factor is the metabolic specificity. And really you're just talking about, when you talk about that metabolic reaction or what it is, you're talking about the predominant energy source required to perform. And as a way to take a look at predominant, and I'll put my exercise physiology caveat out right here. I'm not an exercise physiologist. I work with some really smart ones, and I ask them a lot of questions, and I'm not afraid to steal their knowledge and share it with the world. I do have spent a lot of time trying to learn this as best I can, years and years. That being said, when I present stuff, I tend to oversimplify, and I'll get an email from somebody who is deeper in there and say, well, you didn't go into this, this, and this. I oversimplify the science only because it makes this understanding easy, and I avoid arguments about highly specific points in the science. So when you look at that, overall, you go back to this theory of there's a predominant energy source. You're using one of two energy sources. You're using an anaerobic energy source and an aerobic energy source, right? So you're making energy anaerobically or aerobically. There's actually some other ways you can split it, but just stick with me. We're going to keep it that simple for now. And underneath each, you actually have the ability, and there should be two lines, I know my slide's a little messed up there, to split each area into what I name an anaerobic or a power and endurance. So you have anaerobic power and anaerobic endurance, and they are slightly different in the way you make anaerobic energy, and the same in aerobic power and aerobic endurance. There are two slightly different ways that you make aerobic energy. And understanding that you really have two systems making energy, or two ways you can make energy, of those have two ways you can maximize or target those energy systems, really should drive all the specificity in your intervals. So let's talk about overload, because particularly in the charts I'm going to show you later, it's really important that you think about overload. So overload must be progressive. So the overload or the progressive principle, they're so attached, they're the same thing. So overload must be progressive to continue to prompt training adaptation. So if you start thinking about overload, you're talking about intensity and quantity of work equals some optimal dose response that you hope to get. You're giving a certain dose and you're getting the optimal response. Intensity is really simple, right? You're really thinking about, and again, I'm oversimplifying, but that should help, not hurt. Exercising at a level above normal brings adaptations that improve functional results. The reality is, a training athlete, though normal is ever evolving, right? You have this fitness and fatigue relationship constantly going on, which is evolving normal when it comes to intensity. Quantity. quantity of training is multifaceted, depend on intensity and volume, frequency, you could actually say in there, but also based on underlying capability and fitness. Some athletes aren't fit enough to do a lot of intervals, some are. Some athletes just aren't physiologically good at doing certain intervals, so therefore they suck at it, excuse my French, and they struggle with quantity and getting the right quantity to create physiological demand. Pardon me one second. A little sip of water. But the reality is, if you want to put all that together in this optimal dose response, you've got to be able to quantify that. You have to have a target, say I achieved this target, and then be able to progress off that target. And it's really important that you put that thinking in your mind for some of the stuff I'm going to show you. Don't forget though, quantity does not equal quality. I know you hear that a lot, but it is important to say it. Quality really does trump, particularly in anaerobic intervals. It's not so important in aerobic, but in anaerobic intervals, knowing what you're doing and getting the best interval on the table, the best interval prescribed, and the best interval done really matters. And don't forget, like I said, overload and progression are related. So the reality when you start thinking about interval training, there's an evolution, right? Where did intervals come from? When did we first learn how to do intervals, and when did our body start to adapt to intervals? Well, the reality is that started a long, long time ago. Your interval, your ability to go hard, this intense hard side really is a fight or flight mechanism. Your energy system is designed to support that. And it is the kind of progression. It was the first interval. Get chased by a big dinosaur, you run really, really hard. At some point, you've got to rest, but it is what it is. But if you think about how the interval evolved over time, it really comes from all the way back. And there's plenty of ways to skin this. I'm just giving 2 seconds worth of background. It comes from the Swedish fartlek, which really was this speed play kind of method where you're going hard some and going easy. You're running. It comes from running, so you're running up a hill hard, or you're running a section hard, or you go really hard for 400 meters, 800 meters, whatever, and then take it easy later. But in the late 1930s, these 2 German scientists really got this idea of formalizing intervals into a what they called at the time, and then became intervals, repetition training. And this repetition training was basically based on heart rate, and they would run really, really hard for 100 meters, and then they would walk for 100 meters or something, a certain amount of distance, until a heart rate returned to a certain number, and then they would run really, really hard for 100 meters, and then they would go easy till heart rate returned. If you think about it, that was pretty good game at that stage, right? I mean, they were measuring heart rate. Of course, they didn't have heart rate meters, but they were counting away and using a stopwatch clock time, right? And they were figuring things out. The purpose was that the gain was in the rest period. That was the first time that people really figured that out, right? Don't get me wrong, we had some ideas, there was some knowledge, but it really was the first time we could measure that and understand that, and during that recovery time period, an ability to go more and harder was because of the rest period, and then repeating them in repetition. And basically these guys, their philosophy was do it every day. Like, so you'd show up on the field, they actually had a straight line with 100 meters marked off, and you'd run back and forth every day, and I guess until you couldn't do it anymore. And believe it or not, people got faster, and there were some really good runners at the time who set some 800-meter records and things like that based on this training format. But it would burn them up pretty quickly, as you can imagine. It was fast to gain fitness, fast to lose. They couldn't sustain season and stuff like that. So over the next 70 years, interval brought a bunch of new ideas, but they didn't really evolve off that because we only had heart rate and stopwatches and this base thinking. Well, the reality is, in cycling, in the way before, but by the time we really looked at the mass-produced power meter and what was really accessible, it came about in the late 1990s. The power meter was a game changer. And what the power meter allowed us to do, it began that quantification I was talking about earlier. And then smart people picked up and began to devise ways to look at training effort in what we were describing then as training levels, now tend to be called zones, but then there were training levels. I'm going to demo Dr. Andy Coggins because I think he was one of the first people to do this and do it well. There are others. You might follow Friel's system or other people's system. That's totally up to you. I'm only using one as an example. I do recommend Andy's system. I think his is the best stuff out there, but that's my opinion. You utilize what works for you. What Andy did in this process is really he designed, based off a development of a functional threshold power, a series of training intensities that were loosely linked to physiological response. And he really gave coaches and athletes the ability for the first time to quantify that and then link it back into the desired range of physiological response. And people did. But I need to tell you something and explain this. You might have seen me say it, and I know you've seen Andy say it if you follow him at all. When he wrote these training levels, he meant them to be descriptive, meaning the coach would prescribe intervals. Let's just say intervals in this example. And the coach would prescribe the intervals. The athlete would go out and execute that prescription, then come back and load their file, and the coach and athlete would look at what they did descriptively by comparing it to these training levels by saying, oh, look, you were in this training level for this long, right? So when we say they were descriptive, Andy never initially intended for people to prescribe workouts based off this system. And that's a shock to people when I explain it. And then you watch and most people go, oh, now I know why Andy says that all the time. So that's his point, right? But yet as coaches, it was really easy to prescribe. It gave us a very clear reason and a range to prescribe intervals because it basically supplied us a percentage, a threshold, a number we could wrap our brains around very easily that specifically related, right, to a specific physiological thing, zone, area that we wanted to improve. It gave effort guidance based off threshold and time guidance based off some bell curve of performing athletes. And that was pretty cool, right? It helped us. So what happened is as soon as coaches saw this and Andy said, well, here's some descriptive levels, we all got smart and said, wow, that makes my job easier. I'm going to prescribe in these levels. But the reality is the tool itself was not meant to do that. So that created some issues. It really created two, but let's start with issue number one. Some of the targets did not match capability. Remember what I was talking about? It's got to match your capability. So just as an example, I've done this in the interval individualizing webinar, but I'm just going to show this real quick for those that haven't seen that. If you take two power duration curves, and these are just two power duration curves of different time frames, right? And you put them on the same chart, they look pretty darn similar all the time. There's a sort of a known shape and you expect them to follow. And the reality is they're on the same y-axis. In WKO4, WKO4 auto-scales this axis to try to make everything look reasonably common. The thing is, if you turn off that auto-scale, you can learn one of the key reasons why Coggins Classic levels, these, left some struggle in different types of athletes. So I'm going to show you two athletes of both a very similar FTP. So rider 1 has an FTP of 250 watts. You can see their sprint up here. You know, I should have marked it, but it's probably around 900 watts, 800 watts. And they're dropping off in a normal looking curve, right? And then here all I did is I put lines where the classic, because remember they're just percentages. So I put lines where their classic zones would be. So therefore you could see how their power duration curve passes through kind of slowly through the VO2 or through the VO2 max level 5, definitely flatter through most of level 4 till it drops off. There's actually some real serious tempo drop off going on here. So now you would expect, remember, since these are percentage, every athlete with a similar threshold would have the same cutoff points. But what if you took a different type of athlete and did not, and you forced athlete 2 into the same scale of watts? Here's what athlete 2 looks like. So this rider 2 has a 255 watt FTP, so 5 watts different, I get it. And the picture's a little bigger, so it doesn't line up perfect. I should have shrank it differently. But you quickly get the point, right? You can see this athlete, because look, the scale is the same here. So the athlete goes off the chart. And if they're in these same zones, look how much faster they pass through this zone. There's really no flatness at all in level 4. They're just dropping off, and then they continue to drop off. Under the Coggins Classic level, these two athletes would be doing VO2 max work at the same time and effort. If you put them side by side with this lock, then these pictures don't align great. I'm just making a point. You guys should say like, ooh, that's so cool, Tim, even though my pictures suck. But the reality is it's not lined up well. these are two different athletes. I think everybody gets the point, and prescribing a full zone, a normal zone for them doesn't make sense. Problem two, for everyone, the utilization of descriptive training levels as prescriptive training targets created too broad of a range. So if you took this same strategy, I'm going to give you an example here in anaerobic capacity, right? So let's say you had an athlete with a 350 watt FTP, and I see this happen all the time, you guys. I'm going to make a point here. The anaerobic capacity zone is 121 to 150%. I just pulled this off the same chart you guys have seen 1,000 times. So if you take 350 watt FTP, that means the range they can perform is 423 watts to 525 watts. That's a 102 watt range. The number of times I see somebody pick a time duration that's somewhere within anaerobic capacity and then just say, do this work between 423 and 525 watts is staggeringly high. If you're doing that right now, in my opinion, you're doing it wrong. You're leaving way too broad of a interpretation in your athlete's hands and or in your own self-coaching hands, in your subjective hands, I would guess, if you looked at it that way, to be interpreted on the road and to decide what they're going to do. So the reality is that is too broad to be optimized. It doesn't mean it's not effective. Remember, we're talking about optimization here. Sure, that gets you in the general ballpark and you're playing pretty well, but that's like golfing and never driving for the green. I mean, the reality is, yeah, you can hit the ball down the fairway in the general direction, but you want something with a higher specificity if you want success. So that range is too large. So the reality is that led us to the development of eye levels. So I have one slide on eye levels, then I'm going to press into the new stuff. And pretty much everybody's familiar here. These are the same two athletes. Actually, I think I reversed them in this slide. I noticed that last night. But the reality is their training levels are the same from threshold below, but eye levels individualizes everything above threshold to match that athlete's unique physiology. And you can see here, if you take the Pmax FRC range, rider 1 has 708 to 984, and rider 2 has 522 to 690, dramatically different numbers there. And they're matching the athlete's individual physiology. Then we also started supplying duration ranges where the athlete would get the highest adaptation, the best target for those watts. So here you see 44 to 15 seconds and 32 to 11 seconds as an example. Some range even bigger. I mean, look, this athlete can hold threshold or supra threshold all the way out to about 36 minutes, where this athlete can only hold that just above that supra threshold for only 19 minutes. That's eye levels adapting to individual physiology. And that was an improvement. A lot of people are using eye levels. It's been a great success and a good desire and push. Cool. But the reality is they still work better as a description, not a prescription. So one of the things that we always have wanted to do, and we've always known was in here, is that we did want to solve. Eventually, we gave up that the levels were supposed to be descriptive. I've always prescribed them myself, you know, in certain ways. But the reality is we gave up trying to get everybody convinced that they're descriptive and said, heck with it, let's find a way to make them prescriptive. So the reality, as most people know, is the eye levels are based off the power duration curve. They're based off this power duration curve, which is based off an MMP curve. And it's based off all points of performance. And it takes all those points of performance and it builds what we call a human performance model. And that human performance model is called the power duration curve model because it models the power duration relationship of an individual athlete. Well, that's human performance model. We do know in there, it's based off all points of data, but we do know that certain points have more influence. These points are intersection of time and intensity. If you took a point on this, you have time going from, you know, in your axis. This is logarithmic, by the way, so greater weighting on the shorter times. And then you have power going here. So everything is a cross of, it's an intersection, not a cross, an intersection of time and power. These points of high influence or exertion on the model can be teased out. And these were based on the desired physiological strain. So remember your exercise 101, right? Stress is an external factor. You train and you generate TSS or watts. That's stress. It's an external measurement, external factor. Strain is what your body goes under while that stress is occurring. And then you hope adaptation is a result after some rest. So stress is external, strain is internal. So we're really looking at the physiological strain here. But then we realized we knew these exertion points, and that's what drove eye levels, that we actually could be more specific. That we understood that even though the eye levels are the description and too broad, that actually within each eye level, there's a point of exertion. So we're looking at this power duration curve exertion and just saying, wow, there's just some key select points. And somebody asked me last night, like, are my arrows a specific point? No. They're just dramatic, hey, everybody, here's something on the visual. But we do know what these key visual points are, with these key intersection points from the model within each eye level. So if we understand that and we want a strategy of optimization, we understand these exertion, we know the key points of exertion, we know we have a highly accurate model of the human duration relationship, the power duration relationship of the human. All we really need is two lines. We need to take that point of exertion and begin the thinking on extending to power and time. And it's a time intensity relationship that you're modeling based off the point of highest exertion. So let me define the point of highest exertion because it'll save us later. Highest exertion, when you use models and analytics, you're increasing your odds of success. So you're always doing, there's no perfect, the human body's nuts, it's wacky, it never doesn't always adapt the same and goes through different processes. But you're using, analytics and this type of information to improve your odds of success, sometimes more than others, but it's always an optimization or improvement strategy. A point of exertion shows us the time and intensity that it is most likely to result in the specific desired adaptation. Because we're looking at the model, we're picking out points that are already issuing exertion on that model, and we're able to prescribe them. So the reality is we want that, that fits within the current training levels. And you guys might have seen this slide before. This is the COG and Classic levels, and this is the COG and I levels. And Andy and myself and Debbie Martin from the office created this to give everybody a really clear visual of how this works. It's not like, wow, because we trained the naming of the levels, there's something different going on. All we really did is get a little more specific up here. Sweet spot because it was desired. And here we understood more change was going on, more transition, more individuality in these higher levels, and we needed to address that. The reality is you can go back to my original energy chart, right? You can break aerobic endurance, extensive, and that probably could be a little higher. I always want to move that a little more into the blue. Then you have aerobic power, so right backward, intensive, so endurance and power building. And then the same in anaerobic endurance and anaerobic power. And that's the extensive and intensive approach you might have seen me preach on. Because the reality is, go back to my thinking, you're developing two systems, either the aerobic system or the anaerobic system. Anaerobic system. The reality is there's two types of maximal that resides in here. There's pure max, which is your neuromuscular max, your pure max. So whenever you say, gee, it's why we don't have a level 7 in the old system, because it really is just max. It's just kill it. And that's the same here. We just can quantify it now based off the model. So there's always some room for max power. But there's also something in between this max aerobic power. We used to call this VO2 max because that's what VO2 max is, isn't it? If you think about it, and I know I got poked already for something I'm going to show you by the exercise physiologist last night, and I didn't mean it literally. I'm just trying to help people connect the dots. So your max aerobic power is limited by your VO2 max. By nature, that's what it is. There might be other limitations. You might have problems. You guys, my Microsoft PowerPoint crashed last night, and I'm just seeing it do weird stuff, so it crashes, it'll restart. So there's also a max aerobic power influence here. This is more of a transition, so I'll talk about it. We can tease the other key points out very specifically, and I'm going to show you here in a second, but the max aerobic is more of a transition and picking a key point of transition. So This is the new optimized intervals. So what I placed is a link, and I'm going to tell you it's already outdated. Kevin and I were working on something 5 minutes before this interval, and I was trying to update the folder. But there's going to be a new, let me work backwards. There's going to be a new auto update build that comes out tomorrow with everything that's in that I'm going to show you updated in the new chart library. So all that'll be out tomorrow. What's in the Dropbox link I put in your reminder email is a new build. So if you want to play with it tonight, you can install build 341, I think it is, that's in there. And then this chart, just drag and drop it, same as always, and a little ebook on all the information I'm going over with intervals. So this is the chart, right? And this is what it shows. And there's actually a slight tweak already to what we just gave you. Now, what you're seeing here is the training levels we were discussing. So you see everything above FTP and up. There's no reason to really talk about lower. Here we have the energy system that you're using. So you're seeing extensive, intensive, so you're seeing aerobic and anaerobic. And I probably, just to stay in conjunction with the slide, should call this aerobic power, aerobic endurance. I actually think that would be much clearer. So I'll clean that up today for tomorrow's public release. But I think you guys get the point. Now, the place that is going to be confusing is, and I pointed out later, is this max aerobic as a VO2 max. I'll come back and give feedback. What this is doing for each one of these is it's pulling out the key point, the time point of exertion, remember that intersection point, and the key power, which isn't just the absolute intersection point, there's a little more science behind it, so that you end up with a very specific target of time and power. Now, there's a fine line. Everything over here is generated by the human performance power duration model. Everything over here for now is an estimate, a recommendation based off experience, working with a couple of different exercise physiologists. Dean Golich really helped me fine-tune this, and Andy obviously played a role in that, and different people. But the reality is these are just our estimates. I'm going to go over what they mean here in a little bit and everything else. You should adapt them as for what works for you. So this is giving you some clear targeting. So the example, we see some range, we see some reps, we see some total time, and we see some recovery. So the reality is, in this, I guess I already told, well, actually, let me do it now. When I put max aerobic, it really is just maximal aerobic effort, as hard as you can go aerobically. You used to think about this as a VO2 max interval, but I shouldn't say this, that got confusing. I only wanted to link your thinking back to, that's what VO2 max intervals were or are in your current training. They're really just maximal aerobic intervals. That's what you're pushing and building. So in the new build tomorrow, you won't see that description because it confuses people. There is no VO2 max in that sense. That's why Andy dropped it out of eye levels, and it's why for exercise physiologists, it's not appropriate to call that a VO2 max, a physiological zone or capability known as VO2 max. You don't, it's a limit, it's a function, but it doesn't work. It's not the same. So the reality that will delete out. And then second, if you look at what I'm saying here and adapt this idea now and write this down really, really well. Yeah, here's a good note. So the reason we call this progressive, right, is we're suggesting some reps, you know, how many you do can be up to you, but we are recommending total time based on some of the science. But the reality is the reason we call it progressive. So let's say you're right now for the North Americans, right, and Europeans, you probably have been resting for 2, 4, 6 weeks maybe, and you're just getting back to training. So your intervals, you don't know how many you can do. We have not developed a W prime or a W balance or a map recharge rate or whatever that software calls it, because physiologically you can't do it. I've tested everybody else's version of doing that, every group that says that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so black and white here. I never try to speak negatively about somebody else's stuff, but it really gets to the point where it's misleading. And anybody who wants to disprove that a software can do this, email me and I'll send you 3 workouts, you do them in a row and I'll break it every time. So the reality is, we can't use human performance modeling yet to understand your recharge of anaerobic capacity or your anaerobic battery, or in our language, your functional reserve capacity or FRC. It can't be done in an accurate way. Your body, there's too many variables. from person to person, and then specifically in your body and how it's dealing with fatigue or slight illness or 1,000 things. So we're estimating, we're giving just some generally good guidance. The idea of progressive is the first time you go out and do these sets of intervals, do them till you exhaust. Not total exhaustion like I can't ride home, but like, yeah, I'm done. Then that's your starting point, and from that point, progress your total TIZ, total time in zone, right? So total time in these training levels progress off. So it's a very simple test that people just don't seem to do. Don't guess in the first time you're doing some FRC intervals. Tell the athlete, hey, go out and do as many until you're this fatigued, till you're really, really tired. And then start, you as a coach or a self-coach athlete, next time, do a little more. And then after that, do a little more. And maybe it's not every time, but it should progress like every other time. So most coaches progress too slowly. Progress more, right? Then there's this reality of recovery ratio. So recovery ratio, when you're doing, and so much of the research now is showing the benefit of a lot of intensity work, the reality is anything from FRC intervals above, you really should be going 7 to 12 minutes for a full recovery. The problem is road cyclists and triathletes do not have the discipline to really recover. Our heart rate gets back down in 3 minutes and away we go again because we like to stack intervals like that. But for high intensity intervals to really gain like FRC, you need maximum effort. You need to go really, really hard, and you really have to recover to get the benefit. It's a shame. Track racers tend to know this answer. They're really good at it. They'll go out and do a super hard effort. They'll go hang out in the middle of the track, chill for a little while, catch their breath, get water, do some of their taxes, whatever, right? Then jump on their bike and knock out another one. So the reality is I'm recommending it. I put it here. People are going to balk against it being too long, but it is the best for physiological adaptation, and it is the way you optimized intervals. And you can change it. It's totally customizable in your report, put whatever you want in there, but that's our initial recommendations. So really, when you're talking about max intensive and extensive, I pretty much laid all this out. When you really look at intensive, you're looking at max power for time, and extensive is longer time for power. I've gone over that enough times. I think everybody understands it. Understand it's a process, not an absolute. Therefore, if you're targeting your anaerobic energy system, when you go for anaerobic power, absolutely hard and fully recovered. Super important that you're getting full recovery. Same here, you're just training at a different time and intensity relationship. When you're doing, which is what's happening up here. So let me give you an example of this actually. So I'm going to grab an example here of FRC training. So for this athlete, FRC training or extensive anaerobic training, but FRC training zone is 54 seconds is the time. The target is 430 watts. This is a very small female rider. That target can be plus or watt 15 watts, but you don't want to prescribe much more than that. You want somebody to have a very defined target. We get so used to like, no one can ever, they can't hit a target that tight. Find out. You'd be surprised if targeted that way, how many people will hit it and can hit it. And if they fall off, that tells you something is going wrong. And there's a reason. Is that environmental? Is it fatigue? Is it wrong data? Is something going wrong? We would recommend somewhere between 4 to 8 reps, but find out first, right? Start with till they exhaust. If they do 6 the first time, and by the way, it should be more than 8. I mean, it can be more than 8. One of the things that Dean and I were just talking about is almost like it should say 4+. Really, exhaustion tends to rule on the high side, right? When you're done, you're done. The body's not going to be able to exceed a certain amount. So, but just as a good starting point, you'll find 4 to 8. So let's say they did their test to exhaustion and they could do 5. Start with 5, and then make it 6, and then make it 7. The total time that you're looking for, though, to get an FRC adaptation, and this is based on a lot of scientific literature and stuff like that, and somebody just dumped me a whole bunch more stuff, which I think will support where we're at, but I need to do a bunch of reading and digestion. You need about 10 minutes of total work in that zone. You can rest 1 to 10, 1 to 20, but to be honest with you, I only ducked off of that because of pressure. I would rest 7 to 12 minutes in between and fully recover. Not just your heart rate, but fully recover. Same with other things you're seeing here. We're just using the minimum amount of time. So that should give some insight on how to utilize this. Aerobic, same reality. If you look at the aerobic, I'm not going to go through the arrows again. I think everybody gets what they're looking at here. The only thing I would remind you is max aerobic is more of a transitional. So everything else here is linked to a point of exertion, but max aerobic really is transition. That's why I need to buff that VO2 out of there and make sure everybody, it doesn't confuse anyone. But here's a way to think about it, right? So you can link these two charts together. I did it for Alfred here. So this chart is your FTP contribution with TTE. It's in your workout libraries. Here's this athlete's power duration curve. The blue is their FRC, so their anaerobic contribution to the efforts. The green is their FTP, so their aerobic contribution to the effort, right? And then orange is just a line showing your FTP because that is your aerobic right there. So the reality is if I took 54 seconds, I actually ended up with 55. What you're seeing here is this athlete, most of they're really starting to become aerobic. The aerobic system is really taking over what's contributing, right? So therefore, you don't want to keep going. You're not getting a maximum anaerobic effort, right? It's really becoming more and more aerobic. So if you start thinking about that, that should help you really wrap your brain around why this is a perfect FRC interval, perfect way to build anaerobic, because you're getting a time frame where the effort is draining, totally depleting your FRC work. And then as your aerobic system comes in, you want to stop, rest, and do another interval so you keep getting from here to here, here to here, here to here. That's the absolute best way to improve FRC. That takes some time because it's a change. That takes some time because it's some change, right? So you have to kind of wrap your brain around that. But if you're looking at what I'm saying to you, you're going to say, wow, that visually makes sense to me. And I'm going to give you an example here in a little bit of why that's important. Now, I'm going to go after another long-term standing rule in intervals that drives me crazy. And I'll tackle this in all Q&A if you want me to too. So you know how certain people have taught us that like when you get to a certain level, like power drops off to a certain level, like you've lost X% of power, go home. That is not the right way to do it. It's the way most athletes do it. It is actually the way most athletes, your average everyday athlete, does it. But it's really based off a faulty physiological perception. And it should not. It's something that I'm going to work in the next 6 months to break people's thinking on that, because you're leaving a lot of gain on the table. It was funny. I had a great conversation. We were at the Innovations Conference, and Bobby Julich, who coached Chris Froome when he was with Sky, and Dean Golich and myself were talking about intervals. We're talking about this, optimizing intervals, and actually an audience member had asked us. And the three of us had the exact same opinion of this. And we hadn't really discussed it before. So it was kind of like one of those on the stage, literally an on the stage moment where we're like, holy crap, it's cool to see other people validating, because we mistake the fact that once we no longer can hit the power, right? So remember, stress is the power number. That's how much stress. So suddenly you're doing an interval at 500 watts, whatever this one is, right? And you can only hold 420 watt or 450 watts on the next one. So time to go home. That's not true, because the strain on the strain your body's going under in that 420 watts is still maximal. It's still a deep, deep strain. What you can do is just rest a little longer and do everything you've got. If you watch how a lot of pros do these intervals, and it was funny, Bobby was telling how this was really a game changer for Chris when he got this, is he wouldn't stop when he was tired. He would go, and to the point where he was basically only putting out threshold or less than threshold power. But that's a stress measurement, everybody on this call. It's not necessarily the strain that the body's going under. The strain is way higher when you're that fatigued. Now it's a fine line. That doesn't mean you just keep going until you're laying on the side of the road and somebody's got to show up with an oxygen mask. But a couple of those, once power drop off, those are the intervals to make a difference. So if you're seeing that and you've got it wrapped in your brain that there's a go home point, that's not bad knowledge, don't get me wrong. And for protecting category cyclists and getting good quality basis, But there's a point where you got to take the person, the athlete, or if you are the athlete, go beyond that point, because the strain of those intervals once fatigued is better, it drives better adaptation. And then two, don't be so rigid about the recovery time in between. You can delay the recovery time and get a couple more intervals in. If I just can't hit that power and I need to rest another 40 seconds, we all feel guilty. Literally, I watch road cyclists feel guilty. All right, if it's in your first two, you got a problem. Don't get me wrong. But later, deeper in, you could rest a little longer and squeeze in one more. That's cool. That it will drive better adaptation. I'll tell you right now that Dean and I, based on building this together, Dean Golich and I decided we're going to do an advanced interval education program for people, which I think you'll learn, people will learn a lot of insights about interval training. Here's a great chart of thinking about what I'm showing you. You're still getting that aerobic. Eventually, the power drops all the way down to the point where it's more aerobic, but that strain is much higher. So when you compare levels, you still have this idea of aerobic and anaerobic. We haven't really changed that paradigm. We're just defining some behaviors which are within it. So two caveats. I'm going to answer two. I think I've nailed every question that you guys have answered me, I know, except for three. So one, I was deleting them. Sorry, I can see off my screen. I'm deleting them as I see, so I know I've answered them. Somebody asked, where's the link to the new build? John, it's go to the reminder email. I put a Dropbox link to the reminder email. There's a DMG file in there, which if you're Mac, just double click on the DMG file. And there is an EXE file. If you're Windows, double click on the EXE file. There'll be a new build tomorrow, so you're going to get an auto update tomorrow, which makes all this official. And I already tweaked the chart a little bit based on, I was having a conversation, me, Dean, and Kevin were talking just before this. So in the chart library will be the official optimized zones, which is pretty much what I put in there. It's just a slight tweak and one spelling correction. Actually, I'll tell you what it is. All you'll see in tomorrow's is it deletes the VO2 max intensive, which just shouldn't be there, and it fixes this intensive. Notice that's a misspelling. So that's all. There's no real change in what you'll get tomorrow. Just fixes my stupid mistakes. All right, next question. So somebody asked how the FRC, how does it compare or correlate versus FIC workout examples I've given in the past? Well, the reality is I've been defining as edge intervals, right? Because the edge is the key point. But the reality is this is actually a more specific target. So it's a evolution of what I was saying. And it was part of the point where I kept bringing this idea back to Andy, and he said, yeah, it's good, but there's a better, there's a more succinct point of exertion in there. And I said, well, that's irrelevant if we can't see it. Right? So we sat down and started figuring out a way to find it. So this is the next evolution. This is a little sharper and clarifies that whole strategy because it's a specific point. But if you pay attention at some points, it is that edge. Like in FTP intervals, they're long. Truly build FTP, that's what it is. But look at what it does. You'll find it matches your TTE. So you'll begin to see a relationship between the edge and the target in some unique scenarios. Liz, when are you doing the advanced interval training? It won't be till January. Sorry, this is hard to prepare with all that. And I will tell you that it's going to be part of TrainingPeaks' new, there's a whole bunch of new educational programs for coaches coming out. So it will be part of that rollout. I don't want to spoil what that is. They're doing some really great stuff for coaches and athletes, super cool. So at this stage, you know, some of the presentations and webinars will move into that, you know, type of realm. But it will be some pretty advanced and cool stuff. Okay, with those questions, and yes, I'll say, if anybody, I'll attach this to the follow-up email, the presentation. Somebody's asking for the presentation. Yeah, I send it as a PDF. Please don't use it unless you give WKO4 credit, but I gladly send that. TrainingPeaks, WKO4, whatever we're supposed to say. Somebody asked me this question, so I put it in here. This is, what about testing? What about if you're not upkeeping your power duration curve? Here's my answer. If you're not upkeeping your power duration curve, don't bother. It doesn't work. You know, and it's so funny, the number of people I've had the discussion with recently, and 2 people already asked me on this list, so I'm answering your question now. If you've been the reason is eye levels can have a little bit of a problem, and Kevin and I are working on this for the next build, and so can MFTP, right? In your hero bar, and eye levels is fixed to 90 days. So if you finished last season on some peak event where you were doing really hard efforts, you rest for 4 or 5 weeks, and now you're starting back up, your power duration curve is still carrying some of that older, the 90-day one, and therefore the PD metrics and the eye levels specifically, are still carrying some of that artifice. But the reality is, to get it right, you can always test it, know the change, and run some of I put out a pack of 90, 42, and 28-day curves all on one page. You can just look at them all as one. I recommend a protocol for starting. So if you're going to be using this stuff, and I sell training plans. I have a full instruction kit. I share the instruction kit. If you email me at tim@WKO4, I'll send you my full instruction kit, but I think you'll get most of what I do here. So just understand, all self-coached athletes and coaches, I'm freely sharing information that is IP, and normally is part of the way I make a living. So if you're a self-coached athlete and you're going to send me 5 pages of emails asking me to explain it to you, that's going to be tough for me to do. And stuff like that. So I'm sharing knowledge as best I can, but just realize I won't be able to answer all the deeper coaching questions in it. The reality is I do a 5-day protocol of testing, which is sort of like the old power profile testing. I just break it up into one a day and then a little workout. So I have a VO2 max, an FTP test, anaerobic. So 5 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes, 1 minute, rest, 5 seconds. There's other workouts. I do that once a year, and I'll do that just to start after rest. And it sucks after rest, right? So you rest, take some time off, then you're doing some transitional or cross training. I usually let the person, like if you look at my training plans, I have a week of aerobic endurance riding and then do a testing week just to get people used to being on the bike. But yeah, it sucks because that's your fitness, is what it is. Get over it, because that's the baseline of all the things going forward. You might as well find out what it is. And if your athlete doesn't have the ability to see or isn't tough enough to look at those numbers, they're probably not tough enough to win a race. And beginning that psychological side right now makes you a better coach. I cannot believe the number of people that I've seen now that don't want to test because it's too depressing or the test itself is too hard. Racing is hard. Racing is, if you're a bicycle or a triathlete racer, you picked a really hard freaking sport and you might as well get your body and your mind ready to participate in that game. So I start off with this, and then once every 4 weeks I go to unstructured testing. Unstructured testing is simply choosing points where the MMP curve is most under the power duration curve and testing those time frames. I simply pick a short, medium, and long. I don't necessarily test them all in one day. These shorter ones I typically can build into workouts. So I happen to be doing a high intensity workout. I'll say, hey, athlete Joe, I need you to do 2 times all out 5-second sprints after you get really warmed up. That doesn't kill my workout. It tweaks this up as I go, and it takes away anxiety of it being a formal test. The mid-range ones, sometimes I do that. It depends on how exhausting and can I fit it in and where they're at in a periodized plan. And then this long one is the only one I sort of do formal. The problem is we're so used to only 20 minutes. Everybody ends up with a shelf. You can actually even see it here in this athlete. Look, 20 minutes. Because we never ride our bike hard for more than 20 minutes anymore. And one of the things I'm recommending is that you break that paradigm and go longer. So that's a simple testing protocol. Initial testing to start the model clean, and then unstructured approximately every 3 to 6 weeks. It depends on how you handle the unstructured part of it. And Steve, yeah, exactly. The decay rates vary. What we're going to do, so Steve, it's not a question, you're making a statement really, and your statement is correct. So the decay rates vary, and what he means by that is it's not the same. Your Pmax and your FRC and your FTP decay at different rates once you stop training. Some are more apt to stick with you. Some things are easier to build and faster to lose and that type of deal. So you really need to retest. What Kevin and I are working on as a solution, the short-term solution is we're going to give you a report that lets you see your eye levels based on rolling 90, 42, and 28 days. And the long-term solution is you're going to be able to click on your power duration metrics and set it at 90 or whatever day you want, just like setting CTL. So I think as soon as you can do that, then that'll solve all the problems, because you can simply use the last 2 weeks, which, you want to make sure you have hard efforts. If you start out with the initial testing I just said, it'll be nice and clean. So Steve, if you think about that, that's the way it's a software issue. It's not a power duration curve issue. We just need to get the old data out the backside when we don't want it. So we are going to be working on that. You'll see us one of those two solutions in 7 to 14 days, to be fair. That's one of the things we're working right hard on. So somebody asked me to repeat the 4-day testing protocol. Just, if you really want my testing protocol, just email me at tim@WKO4. I'll send you my entire training plan guide. Just don't use it in your stuff. Don't, just be fair, read it and learn and help yourself, but don't sell it. Second caveat that came up last night that I want to be clear about is, so here's that intersection, what I was calling an intersection, right? And I want to give you this idea of why I personally, this is really my opinion, will either only do it an extensive or an intensive approach. What I find a lot of coaches make a mistake is they're always trying to go in between that approach. I'm trying to get maximum power with the least amount of recovery and the most amount of repetitions. We've all done it. Everybody here take 5 minutes of honesty and say, yeah, I did that too. That was me at certain points, and you might be doing it now. The problem is that rarely ever works. You think you're getting the best of both worlds, intensity and intensive and extensive, or intensity and duration, but you're not. You're getting the worst of both worlds. If you're going to do intensive, if you want to raise anaerobic or aerobic power, do them powerfully. Target max power. Make sure those are as high and as best as you can make them. Therefore, tweak the rest period, make it long enough to fully recover, make them really great high power efforts. When you're doing extensive, make sure that you're controlling that, highly delivered extensive work so that you're really focused on pushing the power curve to the right. Be careful about getting stuck in between. That's a danger to me. And I've watched people do it, and I've done it. I did it for years, and this is how, you learn so much stuff. You just fail time and time again. You bang yourself head against the wall. I mean, when I say me, I said I've not only ever done it to my athletes, which I don't put that in the brochure, I've done it to myself in my own training and just spent time and time again. And then as soon as I learned the discipline of separation and focus and from smart people, in both my coaching and my own personal performance improved. But that's my experience. Test it. Figure it out. Go out and learn. You can test it in very short cycles. Here's how you test it. If you're doing intensive work to raise FRC, you should expect what? You should expect FRC to go up. See, that's what we gave you in WKO4. We gave you a lab that you can test things that you're doing in super short cycles. If you went out and did a bunch of intensive FRC work, what we're prescribing there, you did, I'm not saying do this right now, but I'm just making a point. If you did it 2 to 3 times a week for the next 4 to 5 weeks, would you expect FRC to go up? Yeah. How much? Not sure. What's the cost of that? Does MFTP go down while you're doing it? Probably. But the reality is you can test these things, and we gave you a metric to measure. That's the idea of all these 5, metrics that we gave you, and 6 or 7 if you start thinking about things like VO2 max and muscle fiber type. Right? You have the tools to measure if this works for you and your athletes. Don't just believe me. I'm only giving you my opinion. Go out and test it. This isn't optimized. The only thing I'm saying, the science of what I've just showed you is on the left-hand side. I will absolutely tell you that these are the points of exertion on the human performance model. These are experience and wisdom, and I just gave you some best advice on how to deliver. So that ends the official. There's a Q&A slide, but I'm going to leave this on the screen for questions. I think I got to most of your questions, but now is the time. My email, if you want the book, is tim, T-I-M, @WKO4.com. So really easy, tim@WKO4.com. All right, so Q&A. So I should have a Q&A slide up either way. So Q&A. Now's the time. Oh, wait, I had one other expression. All right, this is really good, so worth doing, because somebody's about to ask me. Sorry, I forgot there were 3 caveats. So check this one out, right? I get this question. I was actually literally having this discussion with somebody on Monday. So, and you've all been in this discussion, right? So I talked to somebody, a rider, or somebody I knew, a friend of a friend, who was talking about how they go out in the Wednesday night worlds, the Wednesday night throwdown, and it's a pretty, 40, 50 people head out, and they go out for about 6, 7 miles, and this person can hang in the group to that point. And then they go up that one hill that's somewhere between 90 and 2 minutes. That was the way it was described to me. And it's kind of medium steep. And then as soon as everybody gets to the bottom of that hill, it's game on. As you know, it becomes throw. Everybody kills it on that hill. The separation happens, and this athlete doesn't make that break and then never ends up finishing with the top pack. So they said to me, so, you know, Tim, you talk about specificity all the time, and here's what I'm doing. I've been going to that hill and I'm doing 2-minute intervals on it, because once they start doing repetition on the hill, it actually takes them longer. So the reality is they're doing like 2 minutes and 15-second intervals on that hill. And they asked me, is that what you mean about specificity in this type of training when we were talking about intervals? So the reality is, remember what I said about specificity, it's the physiology, the underlying physiology that should be the driving, not the only. You still need to know the hill. You still need to know, can I attack a little more here? Is it a little steep here? Here's the place, you know. So being on the hill and doing some work there is important. But when you start talking about the specific metabolic response, what system, right, drives their ability, this athlete's ability to drill it over this hill and make the break? Does anybody know? Their FRC, or their anaerobic work capacity, right? So you have to ask yourself right off the bat, wow, if I want to be able to get over that hill, I need to drive that FRC response. Well, the reality there becomes then, oops, my chart is missing. I had a chart here. Sorry about that. So imagine our chart, right? Athlete, the example I was showing you, that means they need to do 55-second intervals at, what was it, 500 watts or something, to develop, to get maximum optimization of the development, maximum optimization of the adaptation of their functional reserve capacity, anaerobic work capacity, right? If they really want to improve over this hill. So in specificity, I would say, cool, doing it every once in a while to really know the hill and feel it out and feel the demand. I do think that's important. Wow, and I just got like 41 emails. So it's going to take me a while to respond, everybody, I'll tell you right now. But the reality is the energy system that's driving it is your anaerobic work. You're making this energy, you know, generally, remember my contribution chart, but most of this energy is coming anaerobically. Improving your FRC is the most and best way if you want to get over with the break. So the reality is that's what they need to make the improvement. They need to focus on that energy system. Then somebody asked me yesterday, well, how often would you do the FRC intervals versus do some things on the hill? And I said about 5 to 1. I'd still do some work on the hill, don't get me wrong. There's always a certain part of specificity of adapting to the course, right? Remember what you guys have always heard me say, great training is about ability of the rider meets demands of the course. By the end of the day, they're not going to, regardless of how well they know this hill, they're not going to escape that they're being capped by their FRC. The higher FRC, the faster they're going to go over it. That alone should give you really good insight in a change, in some change in your thinking about how you prescribe intervals. Because I often see people saying, oh, well, let's do a 2-minute interval then. You know, and the reality is go right at it, build the energy system. Antonio, that's a really good question. I'm not going to say it out loud, but yeah, if you know your math, you are in one way or another sort of talking about that. So obviously you have a grasp of mathematics. Mark, would you recommend doing these hard intervals in base phase or only really in build? So I really look at the ebook. I ducked it in the ebook too, that's in that folder, because it really is the art of coaching. But in the same thing, I will always give my recommendation. I believe it's a periodized approach. I like taking the extensive approach first and then moving intensive later. In the base period, I think most people do not go hard enough in the base period, and I do keep a certain amount of intensity work in my base period. To be more specific, again, just sharing my knowledge, I, based on the athlete, will do a FRC style workout, not saying exactly FRC, but typically, yeah, I mean, that's the one I choose, to be honest with you, once every, I don't know, 10 to 14 days. Because otherwise than that, you end up having to rebuild so much in the spring. It's too much loss. It doesn't make you a January star. It's not going to bring you onto peak. It's not going to overcreate fatigue. It's just going to make sure it's not going to build FRC either. It's just going to maintain. Now, if I had an athlete that was really struggling with FRC and we thought we could make a breakthrough, I might do it as much as once a week through the winter. Because if they really, really had to have it because of the event or something like that, it might be important enough creating the extra fatigue and risking a little bit of a hard to control peak. That's the art of coaching and the things you have to think through. So great question. Not sure you saw this, but any thoughts on including optimized intervals for tempo intervals? No. So the reality is really once you get into SST, it's really just a matter of progression and time. The reality is, if you remember from the individualization and why we did eye levels, there isn't being overly specific and below threshold efforts, supra and below. I said supra earlier, I meant super threshold, but below, really, it's not worth this. It's just an extra headache of specificity. The best tempo you can do is progressive. And I always preach that. And don't do it all steady state. Do some of it as a tan. Do in the winter, do 1 out of 4 with more variability. And if you can do 45 minutes today, do 47 minutes tomorrow and do 50 minutes the day after and progress it. Always be pushing the progression. Don't have to drive for more power in the winter. More time. Build fatigue resistance. It will lead to better performance results. So push the time element. If you're feeling really good and you're like, wow, I can go past 50 minutes, great. Don't go harder. The mistake most people make in tempo and SST is they get on in the first minute and they're like, man, I feel like Superman. So they go 10 watts harder, but they end up barely making it to the time frame. If you feel good in the base period, extend time, don't increase power. The power increase as you get fit will just happen naturally, but you got to push to extend time. Later, when you get into late base and build, then start increasing the power and fixing the time. Cool. Yeah, there is a TPU WKO4 in Boulder. I guess there's a whole bunch of new stuff posted. I haven't seen it, but there's a TPU. It might be announced already, so hopefully I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, but it sounds like it is based off what you guys are saying. I'm so up on things, right? There's a TPU in Mallorca, in the little island in the Mediterranean off of Spain, because it's very easy for Brits, Germany, Spanish. It's very easy to get to neutral place. And there's a camp we're actually doing. I'm coaching a power camp there, which if you want information on that, email me at tim@WKO4 and I can send you links. I think it's actually linked right into the TPU. So myself and some pretty interesting staff members will be there teaching power for a week. Then in the fall, there's a TPU in Boulder also going on. So you can attend one of those TPUs when I say TPU, I mean TPU WKO4 on our WKO4 topic. So I'm just keep asking questions, you guys. You can drop off as you go. I don't mind. I'm going to go ride the trainer, so I'm stalling. It's too cold to go outside. Oh, great. Yeah. I know this is off topic, so Tom, I'll tackle it. I know this is off topic, so it might not make sense to answer now. What is the difference between prescribing a 15-minute interval on a steep hill versus a flat? If you are maintaining certain power, isn't it the same? It's generally the same, but you have to reverse it. Certain people can make more power on a climb. It's just part of the way their makeup is, physiology, weight, other stuff. So you can produce more power. Some are more capable of producing power on a climb, and some are actually more capable of producing on a flat. The difference is the way you pedal and engage muscle. There is a slight difference going uphill because of the angle of the bike. Some people put a lot of weight on that slight difference and weighting, saying it is important. I do believe it's important. To me, if the athlete has to climb, so let's say they have events that have a lot of climbing in it, I want them to do their 15-minute intervals and climbs or simulate the climb on a trainer. If they're spending in the summer or in their race season or their big race is really flat, I'm not too interested unless it really affects their way to make power. So hopefully that is a reasonably clear answer. So a question, a tech, can I load the WKO4 chart that you have loaded in the Dropbox? If you upgrade your current build is like 331. If you upgrade the build that's in the Dropbox, the WKO4 first, so close your WKO4 and double click on any one of those files and go through the upgrade process, choose replace, It won't change any of your data. It's just going to replace the build. Then once you have that new version, then drag and drop the chart I put in there, and you'll get the chart that's on my screen. Cool. I think I got through questions. Feel free. Like I said, I saw in one batch, I saw 40. My Mac said 41 new emails. So I'm going to assume that was you guys. So give me the night through the night to kind of get back to the emails, and I'll try to answer your questions. I really appreciate everybody being on tonight. Hopefully this continues to help everybody learn and think about what they're doing. Have fun working with it. It'll be out on official release tomorrow. So if you don't want to go and load your own model and everything else, it'll be out tomorrow. And there's one final question. This is a pretty good one, so I'll take this. And then I promise I'm signing off. Another off-topic question. I watched your video about how to build an annual plan. Any chance you guys could do one that focuses on Ironman? I know the concepts are similar, but there are differences in what. Yeah, the reason we've stayed from, people ask us why aren't we doing more for triathletes? We are actually doing a lot for triathletes. I'll be very blunt about the answer. We're afraid that we're going to get skewered because running power data and swim information isn't as fine-tuned as cycling data. So when you apply it to such advanced analytics, it can lead to some pretty wacky answers. So running with power is quickly maturing, and probably within the next 60 days is really going to be at the point where it's beyond true, like beta, and give us really actionable data. As that comes, we'll do more work in triathlon. And then swimming data is really a challenge. I think everybody thinks it's highly accurate because you have a number, but if you looked underneath at the file, it's pretty wacky data because you're underwater, it's stopping at a pool edge. Are you turning in a lap, or are you stopped and resting? So that data, so we're afraid to push such high-end analytics to when the data isn't. So we're trying to give good overarching information that helps translation. As you guys know, Andy's doing a tremendous amount of running with power. He presented a whole new power idea at the Innovations Conference, which you'll probably see public in WKO4. And I never like to put a date, but it isn't more than, hopefully not more than a month. When we get to that level and we have more accurate data, you're going to see us doing more with the triathlon market. If we feel good about that, then yeah, we definitely want to repeat a lot of this stuff for triathletes also. Just we're afraid, if you think about it, Liz, like if the data is bad and we say, here's an idea that works, a lot of people, like take running with power. There's a lot of people who jumped on and said, here's the facts. They didn't even look if the underlying data was accurate, which early on it had some problems, and they've been changing it. So even your old data relative to you isn't as accurate as the data you're getting now because it's changed. So we're just waiting it out. I know that we have very smart people who are working on it, like Dr. McGregor is doing some work there, along with Dr. Andy Coggin, along with Dean Golich, and along with Kevin and I. So there are people now studying it and using real data and force plate studies and things like that to really nail it down and how it best works. And I think running with power is going to be very cool soon. I think it's a cool device. If you haven't gotten one, get one. So I recommend them. I'm just saying the knowledge of what to do with it and the quality of analyzing and using the data isn't quite there yet, but it's going to be. That's just hammering out some of the bug stuff. Cool. All right, excellent. Everybody have a great evening. Have some fun, jump on your trainer or go ride your bike, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks again.